What happened to those African American lunches no one makes anymore, the ones that carried families through the day? These lunches turned scraps and gardens into filling plates that meant survival. If we forget them now, what part of our story disappears? Stewed pigeon peas with rice was one of those quiet staples that held its place on lunch tables in African American kitchens, especially in communities touched by Southern and Caribbean influences. Pigeon peas, small and earthy, were simmered slowly with onion, peppers, and broth until tender, then poured over rice for a filling plate that stretched far with little cost. Fatback or ham hock was sometimes added for flavor, but many families kept it meatless when money was tight. The dish carried with it the reminder of resourcefulness, because peas and rice were inexpensive, nourishing, and easy to grow or store. Children often grew up on bowls of this, eating it at midday before chores or school, while adults leaned on it as dependable sustenance during work. It was hearty without being heavy, flavorful without requiring expensive spices, and versatile enough to be reheated later. Today, stewed pigeon peas with rice is rarely thought of as lunch, but it once carried the weight of survival and comfort at the same time. Fried tripe sandwiches were once a common lunch that stretched butcher scraps into something filling and portable. Tripe, the lining of a cow's stomach, was cleaned, boiled until tender, then breaded and fried crisp. The fried pieces were slipped between slices of white bread and often dressed with mustard, hot sauce, or pickles for a sharp bite. For many families, tripe was inexpensive compared to other meats, making it an affordable protein that could be fed to children or carried in lunch pails to work. Though the texture was chewy and the flavor strong, frying gave it a golden crust that made it more appealing. Adults appreciated the thriftiness and the seasoning that could transform tripe into a savory meal, while children often tolerated it when hungry. These sandwiches were tied to a time when nothing from the butcher was wasted. They have nearly vanished today, but once they represented both survival and ingenuity. Okra and corn succotash was one of those dishes that carried the memory of gardens into midday meals. Fresh or preserved okra was chopped into coins and sautéed with corn kernels, often flavored with a little fatback or bacon grease for richness. The result was a skillet lunch that was bright, tender, and full of flavor, served either alone or with bread to make it more filling. For families living off small gardens or victory plots, okra and corn were easy crops that stretched well through the season. Succotash was hearty enough to keep adults working through the afternoon, but also mild enough for children to enjoy. It was a way of celebrating what was grown at home while saving money at the same time. Though succotash is rarely thought of today, it once stood proudly as a thrifty and nourishing lunch plate in African American kitchens, tying community, land, and resourcefulness together. Cabbage and potato cakes were a thrifty lunch born out of leftovers that would have otherwise gone to waste. Mashed potatoes were mixed with boiled or stewed cabbage, then shaped into patties and fried until golden on both sides. The cakes were served hot, often with a slice of bread or cornbread on the side to make the meal more filling. Housewives liked them because they transformed scraps into something satisfying, stretching meals when meat was scarce or too expensive. Children enjoyed the crisp outside and soft inside, making them easier to eat than plain cabbage. Adults leaned on them as a quick solution that required no new ingredients and could be cooked in minutes. The cakes symbolized a kind of frugality that did not feel like sacrifice, since they carried flavor, texture, and comfort. Today they have mostly disappeared, but at one time cabbage and potato cakes represented both resilience and everyday ingenuity. Corn pone and buttermilk plates were a steady lunch that spoke of tradition and simplicity. Corn pone was a dense, unleavened cornbread made from cornmeal and water, baked or fried until firm. It could be served warm or cold, often sliced into wedges or squares. Paired with a bowl or glass of tangy buttermilk, it became a complete meal that filled stomachs without needing expensive meat. The combination was a fixture in African American households, particularly in rural areas where cornmeal and dairy were cheap and accessible. Children often dipped their corn pone directly into the buttermilk, softening it into something almost like porridge, while adults valued it for its straightforward nourishment. It was quick, inexpensive, and familiar, the kind of food that connected families to earlier generations. Though rarely remembered today, corn pone and buttermilk once carried dignity in their simplicity, proving that even the humblest ingredients could make a lasting lunch tradition. Stuffed collard rolls were an inventive lunch that transformed everyday greens into something hearty and memorable. Large collard leaves were blanched until pliable, then filled with a mixture of rice, onions, and small bits of pork or ham for seasoning. The rolls were tied or folded neatly, then simmered in broth until tender. This dish stretched small amounts of meat across many portions, making it economical yet satisfying. Housewives appreciated the recipe because collards were abundant and inexpensive, while rice added bulk and nutrition. Children sometimes resisted the leafy greens, but usually enjoyed the savory rice filling inside. Adults admired the way this meal turned familiar garden produce into something that felt both substantial and comforting. Stuffed collard rolls reflected both thrift and creativity, carrying influences from African, Southern, and even immigrant cooking traditions. Today, they are seldom seen, but at one time, stuffed collard rolls were a proud symbol of resourcefulness in African American lunch tables. Giblet stew over rice was a lunchtime staple that used parts of the chicken often discarded or overlooked. Giblets, hearts, gizzards, and livers were simmered with onions, garlic, and simple seasonings until tender, then poured over rice for a filling plate. The stew was deeply savory, inexpensive, and stretched easily to feed large families. Housewives liked the dish because nothing went to waste, and even a single chicken could provide multiple meals when every part was used. Children sometimes balked at the idea of giblets, but the flavor was rich enough to win them over, especially when smothered in gravy. Adults valued it for both its thrift and its nourishment, as giblets were dense in protein and iron. It was the kind of food that turned necessity into comfort, and it stood as a reminder that creativity often came from constraint. Today, giblet stew is rare at lunch tables, but once it represented survival and sustenance. Hog jowl and greens plates were a noontime meal that carried both tradition and thrift. Smoked hog jowl, cut from the pig's cheek, was boiled or fried until tender, then served alongside or cooked into a pot of collard or mustard greens. The result was smoky, savory, and nourishing, filling plates without costing much money. For families working long hours in fields or factories, this meal provided strength and satisfaction. Children grew up associating its flavors with home, while adults saw it as a reminder of heritage and necessity. The dish reflected a time when every part of the hog was valued, not just the more expensive cuts. It tied together meat and vegetables in a way that was practical yet deeply flavorful. Today, hog jowl and greens are seldom served as lunch, but once they were a cornerstone of African American midday meals, embodying resilience, thrift, and cultural pride. Fried croaker fish sandwiches were a common lunch in coastal African American communities where small fish were plentiful and affordable. Croaker fish were cleaned, seasoned, dredged in cornmeal, and fried whole until crisp. They were slipped between slices of bread, sometimes with onion or mustard for extra flavor. The bones were small enough to eat around easily, making the sandwich both convenient and filling. Housewives relied on it because croaker was cheap, quick to fry, and satisfying for both children and adults. The sandwiches were portable, making them ideal for workers carrying lunch to the fields, docks, or factories. They carried the taste of the sea into everyday life, celebrating both local resources and frugality. Today, fried croaker sandwiches have mostly vanished from tables, replaced by other fish options, but they once stood as a symbol of how African American kitchens turned abundance into sustenance, making something ordinary into something sustaining. Vegetable chow chow sandwiches were one of the thriftiest lunches found in African American homes. Chow chow, a tangy relish made from cabbage, peppers, onions, and green tomatoes, was chopped finely and preserved in jars. Spread thickly on bread, it became a quick sandwich filling that was sharp, colorful, and inexpensive. Families often made chow chow during the summer harvest, ensuring jars lined the pantry shelves for the year ahead. When meat was unavailable or too costly, chow chow sandwiches provided a burst of flavor that made plain bread into a meal. Children might have found the relish too strong, but adults appreciated its tang and variety. The sandwiches carried both the taste of summer gardens and the practicality of preservation, reflecting how African American kitchens stretched harvests through the seasons. Today, chow chow is rarely remembered outside of Southern cooking, but once vegetable chow chow sandwiches were a resourceful and flavorful way to keep lunch simple yet satisfying. Pumpkin and corn stew was a lunch that carried both thrift and comfort, filling bowls with the flavors of the field. Cubes of pumpkin were simmered slowly with kernels of corn, onions, and simple seasonings until tender. The sweetness of the pumpkin blended with the corn to create a dish that was hearty but never heavy, a perfect partner to warm slices of cornbread served on the side. Housewives liked it because pumpkin was easy to grow and store, while corn was plentiful in most communities, making the combination both accessible and affordable. Children often enjoyed the mild sweetness, while adults appreciated how filling it was after long hours of work. The stew reflected both practicality and heritage, drawing on African and native food traditions that celebrated vegetables at the heart of the meal. Pumpkin and corn stew rarely appears on modern tables, but at one time it was a symbol of how communities turned simple crops into sustenance, carrying both nourishment and cultural memory in every bite. Boiled okra and rice bowls were one of the simplest midday meals, stripped down to nothing but essentials. Fresh okra pods were boiled until soft, then spooned generously over hot rice with a little salt and sometimes a splash of hot sauce or vinegar. The texture was slippery and not to everyone's taste, but the dish filled stomachs when little else was available. Housewives leaned on it because okra and rice were cheap and easy to prepare quickly, making it a dependable option when other ingredients were scarce. Children sometimes turned their noses up at the sliminess, but many grew up with it as a familiar part of daily life. Adults appreciated the steady nourishment and the ease of cooking something so simple. Though plain compared to other lunches, boiled okra and rice represented survival and thrift, proving that even the most basic foods could sustain families through lean times. Today it is nearly forgotten, but once it was a staple. Cowtail stew with vegetables was a dish that transformed tough cuts of meat into rich, sustaining meals. Oxtail or cowtail was simmered slowly for hours with onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever greens were available until the broth turned thick and flavorful. The meat became tender, falling from the bone, and was poured over bread or rice to stretch it further. Housewives valued the dish because cowtail was cheaper than prime cuts, yet with time and patience it could feed a whole family. Children often found joy in the richness of the stew, though they sometimes left the bones behind, while adults appreciated the depth of flavor that came only from long simmering. It reflected a tradition of making the most of what the butcher offered, ensuring nothing went to waste. Today, cowtail stew has nearly vanished from lunch tables, but once it was a symbol of resourceful cooking, heritage, and comfort served steaming hot. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was a Southern adaptation of African recipes that carried both thrift and flavor. Peanuts were ground into a paste or simmered with broth, then combined with chunks of sweet potato to create a thick, hearty stew. The dish was rich, slightly sweet, and deeply satisfying, making it a popular choice when meat was scarce. Housewives liked it because peanuts were cheap and abundant, while sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil, ensuring both ingredients were accessible to nearly everyone. Children enjoyed the creamy texture and natural sweetness, while adults valued the nourishing balance of protein and starch. It reflected African roots adapted to American kitchens, showing how cultural memory survived in food. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was more than a meal. It was a link between past and present, carried in every bowl. Though it has faded from everyday lunches, it once represented resilience, thrift, and heritage on Southern tables. Grease bread sandwiches were a no-frills lunch that made the most of every scrap left from cooking. After frying meat like bacon or salt pork, the leftover drippings were spread onto bread, sometimes sprinkled with a little salt or pepper. The result was a sandwich that was greasy, salty, and filling enough to tide someone over until dinner. Housewives relied on it because it wasted nothing, stretching even the smallest amount of meat into another meal. Children sometimes enjoyed it for its richness, though it was not always seen as a treat, while adults accepted it as a quick way to satisfy hunger. Grease bread sandwiches reflected the wartime and Depression-era mentality of using every resource to its fullest. Though far from glamorous, they carried both nourishment and necessity in their simplicity. Today they have nearly disappeared, but once they were a symbol of thrift and survival in African American kitchens. Pickled okra and cheese sandwiches were an unusual but clever way to combine tangy preserved vegetables with creamy dairy. Crisp pickled okra was sliced lengthwise and layered onto soft white bread with slices of sharp cheese, often cheddar or American. Sometimes a smear of mayonnaise was added to bind it together, creating a sandwich that was salty, tangy, and smooth all at once. Housewives appreciated it because pickled okra could be stored for months and used quickly, while cheese provided both protein and richness. Children often found the pairing strange, but adults enjoyed the sharp flavors that contrasted against soft bread. The sandwich was practical for picnics, lunch boxes, or quick meals at home, requiring almost no preparation. Pickled okra and cheese sandwiches represented the ingenuity of combining preserved foods with fresh staples to stretch resources. Though nearly forgotten today, they once carried novelty and thrift, standing as a reminder of mid-century creativity. Salt pork and cabbage skillets were hearty lunches that filled tables with warmth and thrift. Chopped salt pork was fried until browned, then shredded cabbage was added to the pan and cooked down until tender. The pork fat flavored the cabbage, transforming a simple vegetable into a savory meal. Sometimes onions or potatoes were added to stretch it further, but even on its own it was filling and satisfying. Housewives valued the recipe because salt pork was inexpensive, long-lasting, and easy to store, while cabbage was available year-round and cheap. Children often found the flavor strong, but adults embraced it as comfort food that reminded them of both thrift and tradition. It was a dish that fed large families with very little cost, making it practical during hard times. Today, salt pork and cabbage skillets are rarely remembered, but once they represented resilience, creativity, and the ability to turn scraps into sustaining meals. Pokeweed greens with cornbread were a survival lunch that carried caution as well as nourishment. Young pokeweed shoots, carefully harvested before they grew toxic, were boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness and danger. Once tender, they were seasoned lightly and served alongside cornbread for a meal that was simple yet filling. Foraging pokeweed required knowledge passed through families, since picking it at the wrong stage could be harmful. Housewives valued it because it was free food gathered from the land, while cornbread turned it into a complete meal. Children rarely enjoyed the bitter taste, but adults accepted it as a dependable option when money or supplies were scarce. It was a dish that spoke to resilience and the close relationship between people and the land. Today, pokeweed greens are largely forgotten, but once they were an important reminder that survival often meant making the most of what nature provided, even when risky. Turtle stew with dumplings was a rural dish that reflected both necessity and ingenuity. Turtle meat, often from snapping turtles caught in rivers or ponds, was simmered slowly with vegetables until tender. Dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the broth, creating a hearty stew that could feed many mouths. Housewives valued the dish because turtles were free to catch and stretched into a full meal when paired with dumplings. Children were sometimes hesitant about the idea of eating turtle, but the savory stew usually won them over. Adults appreciated its richness and the way it warmed and satisfied, especially during lean seasons. Turtle stew with dumplings represented survival cooking, where every resource from the land or water could become nourishment. Today, it is almost entirely forgotten, but once it was a vital dish that showed how African American families combined ingenuity and resourcefulness with tradition and need at the lunch table. Fried pig ear sandwiches were a lunch that turned overlooked parts of the hog into something flavorful and memorable. Pig ears were cleaned, boiled until tender, then fried until crisp on the outside while still chewy within. The ears were tucked into slices of white bread with mustard or hot sauce for sharpness. Housewives liked the recipe because it used cuts of meat that were inexpensive and often discarded, making them an affordable protein source. Children sometimes struggled with the chewy texture, but adults embraced the flavor and thrift. The sandwich was portable, easy to prepare, and filling enough to carry someone through the day. It reflected a tradition of honoring the whole hog, ensuring nothing was wasted. Fried pig ear sandwiches have nearly vanished today, but once they stood as a symbol of practicality and heritage, reminding families of how resourcefulness turned even the humblest parts of the animal into sustaining meals. Ash cake cornbread lunches were one of the most rustic meals, made by pressing cornmeal dough into patties and baking them right in the ashes of a fire. The cakes would be brushed clean and eaten with molasses, beans, or whatever side was on hand. This method required no fancy pans, only a fire and a little patience, making it practical for field hands or families with few tools. Housewives appreciated it because cornmeal was cheap, plentiful, and versatile, while the technique wasted nothing. Children sometimes loved the sweetness when molasses was poured on top, while adults valued the filling heartiness that kept them working through the day. Ash cakes carried history too, tied to African and native traditions of cooking close to the earth. Though humble, they symbolized resourcefulness and survival, showing how even ashes could become part of the kitchen. Today, they are nearly forgotten, but once ash cake cornbread lunches were proof that thrift and creativity could turn the simplest ingredients into sustenance. Okra and rice patties were a clever way to combine two staples into a dish that felt both filling and practical. Leftover cooked rice was mixed with chopped okra, seasoned with onion or pepper, and shaped into patties that were fried until crisp. The texture balanced the softness of rice with the chew of okra, producing something that could be eaten by hand or served on a plate. Housewives liked the recipe because it stretched leftovers into another meal, ensuring nothing went to waste. Children sometimes disliked the sliminess of okra, but the frying helped disguise it, making the patties more appealing. Adults appreciated that it was hearty enough to stand alone yet versatile enough to pair with greens or beans. Okra and rice patties reflected both thrift and creativity, proving how African American kitchens worked with what was available. Though rarely made today, they once symbolized survival cooking that turned plain staples into a lunch with flavor and substance. Cane syrup over cold biscuits was a lunch that turned leftovers into comfort. Biscuits left from breakfast would be split open and covered with thick cane syrup, soaking into the bread until sweet and sticky. It was quick, inexpensive, and satisfying, requiring nothing more than what was already on hand. Housewives appreciated this because it wasted nothing, stretching food into another meal without extra cost. Children loved it because the syrup turned plain bread into a treat, while adults valued the energy it gave when paired with coffee or milk. Cane syrup was widely available in the South, making it a natural companion to biscuits that might otherwise go stale. The dish was simple, but it represented practicality, turning scraps into nourishment. Though it might seem plain now, cane syrup over cold biscuits was once a beloved quick meal, a reminder that even leftovers could carry sweetness and comfort during hard times. Fish head stew with vegetables was one of those meals born from the determination to waste nothing. Fish heads, often discarded, were simmered with onions, carrots, and potatoes until they created a rich broth full of flavor. The meat from the head was picked carefully, adding texture to the stew and stretching it further. Housewives valued this dish because it took what others threw away and transformed it into something filling enough for the whole family. Children were often squeamish about eating fish heads, but the flavor of the stew usually won them over once served with bread or rice. Adults appreciated the thrift and nutrition, especially when fishing provided a steady supply of inexpensive food. Fish head stew carried cultural memory too, tied to traditions of using the whole catch. Though uncommon today, it once stood as a symbol of making the most of every resource and turning scraps into sustenance. Fried cabbage and onion sandwiches were a lunch that blended thrift with bold flavor. Cabbage and onions were sliced thin, sautéed in fat until browned, and then layered between slices of bread, sometimes with mustard or vinegar for extra bite. The result was savory, filling, and inexpensive, perfect for families looking to stretch vegetables into a meal. Housewives liked the recipe because both cabbage and onions were cheap, kept well, and cooked down into something hearty. Children might not have loved the strong taste, but adults valued the way it satisfied hunger without needing meat. It was a practical lunch for field hands, school children, or anyone who needed something portable and quick. Fried cabbage and onion sandwiches reflected the resilience of kitchens that turned simple ingredients into nourishment. Though rarely eaten today, they once carried both flavor and tradition, proving that even the humblest foods could be transformed into something worth remembering on the lunch table. Hog kidney stew was a dish that made use of organ meat, transforming what some discarded into a sustaining lunch. Kidneys were cleaned, chopped, and simmered with onions and potatoes until tender, creating a savory stew rich in flavor. It was often eaten with cornbread, which helped stretch the meal further and soak up the broth. Housewives valued the recipe because hog kidneys were inexpensive and often overlooked, yet with careful cooking they became nourishing. Children often hesitated at the idea of eating kidneys, but adults appreciated the practicality of using every part of the animal. The dish reflected the cultural emphasis on thrift, making nothing go to waste. Hog kidney stew was not glamorous, but it represented resilience and the determination to make meals from whatever was available. Though rarely eaten now, it once stood proudly in kitchens as a symbol of resourcefulness and tradition, feeding families during times when frugality mattered most. Turnip and pea skillets were a flavorful lunch that stretched simple vegetables into something filling and thrifty. Diced turnips were fried with peas, often in pork fat, and seasoned with scraps of ham or onion to deepen the taste. The combination balanced the earthy bite of turnips with the sweetness of peas, creating a dish that was both hearty and satisfying. Housewives liked it because turnips and peas were inexpensive, easy to store, and versatile enough to serve alone or alongside bread. Children sometimes resisted the sharp flavor of turnips, but adults embraced the dish as both practical and nourishing. It was quick to prepare, making it useful for midday meals when time and resources were limited. Turnip and pea skillets carried the spirit of making the most of garden vegetables and stretching every ingredient. Though rarely seen now, they once reflected both thrift and creativity, proving that even modest produce could build a memorable lunch. Boiled corn on the cob with bread was a simple but filling midday meal, rooted in both thrift and tradition. Fresh ears of corn were boiled until tender, then served hot with slices of bread to round out the plate. Sometimes butter or drippings were added for flavor, but even plain, the combination filled stomachs. Housewives valued it because corn was inexpensive, plentiful, and easy to prepare, while bread stretched the meal into something more substantial. Children loved biting into sweet corn, while adults appreciated its practicality and the steady energy it provided. It was a dish that reflected the rural rhythms of eating what was in season, simple and unadorned, but dependable. Though it might seem too plain for modern tables, boiled corn with bread was once a regular lunch, proving that even the simplest foods carried meaning and comfort when shared at the family table. Fried sweet potato sandwiches were one of those clever meals that turned a single vegetable into something substantial. Sweet potatoes were sliced, fried in fat until browned, and then tucked between slices of bread, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses or mustard. The result was sweet, savory, and filling, perfect for a quick lunch. Housewives liked the recipe because sweet potatoes were inexpensive, nutritious, and easy to grow in southern soil, making them dependable for large families. Children often enjoyed the sweetness, while adults valued the way the sandwich satisfied hunger without needing meat. Fried sweet potato sandwiches reflected a culture of thrift, using what was available to make meals hearty and flavorful. Though largely forgotten today, they once stood as proof that even a single vegetable could be transformed into a centerpiece of the table, carrying both nourishment and tradition with every bite served in mid-century kitchens. Mustard greens and cornmeal dumplings were a lunch that blended greens with filling starch to create a complete meal. Fresh mustard greens were simmered slowly until tender, flavored with bits of pork or drippings, and dumplings made from cornmeal were dropped into the pot to cook. The result was savory, earthy, and comforting, a dish that filled bellies without needing expensive ingredients. Housewives liked it because both mustard greens and cornmeal were inexpensive, abundant, and dependable, stretching far to feed large families. Children sometimes resisted the bitterness of greens, but the dumplings softened the flavor, making it more appealing. Adults appreciated the warmth and nourishment, especially on long workdays. Mustard greens and cornmeal dumplings reflected the tradition of combining vegetables and grains into meals that felt complete, sustaining families with thrift and ingenuity. Though rarely cooked today, they once carried both heritage and necessity, standing as a symbol of resourceful African American kitchens. Drop your favorite forgotten lunch in the comments. Hit like if you are hungry for more, and subscribe so we can keep serving up history with a side of flavor.